The feast of St. Charles Borromeo takes us back to a moment in providential history when, out of the blue, something which in itself was a bit spooky turned out extremely well. Paul IV, the new Pope, he was from the Medici family, chose, as was the custom of the time, someone that he knew from his own family as Cardinal Archbishop. It was the very young Carlo. He became, first of all, Cardinal Priest of St. Praxede in Rome, but he was eventually ordained and made also bishop very quickly, and cardinal. And Milan is a very important church, indeed to this day has its own rite. And if one is celebrating there, used to the Roman rite, it creates a few hiccups because things happen here and there that one is not expecting. And it is still to this day actually quite a vibrant centre of Christianity. Youth movements, strong intellectual life, powerful pastors and preachers, and on it goes. But it is also linked with this origin, but it was a centre of the Counter-Reformation applied very well. Remember now that we're in the years when the Holy Spirit was cleaning up the church in reaction to the protests which by then were leaving it, and rather than containing them, it was having to see them go out. Indeed, I was very saddened when a friend of mine told me in Rome that one can see two altars close to each other. There where St. Maximilian Kolbe had his first Mass, which I found eventually unused after my ordination for one of my first, and another where Martin Luther celebrated his last. And off he went with himself and took a big chunk of Christianity in Middle Europe with him. Charles worked within the structure, and he, from his union with Christ, was able to act on every possible level. He had an intuition of the importance of relationship with his own priests in a very big diocese, and he had the practice of having synods already, and he wanted to know what they thought. Indeed, we have in his words to his own priests in one of these synods, the last that he held, a whole program of spirituality for the man of God, which explains why he had that point of departure and was able then to act precisely as a pastor, not coming at it, as it were, as a perfect programmer of the Holy Spirit, but as somebody listening to what Holy Spirit was doing and what people were trying to say and to their pain, for he loved his people on a personal level. Now, there are a few tips which are worth taking with us from what he has taught his own priests, and therefore any soul engaged with the matters of God. Firstly, there is the question of balance. If one talks to many pious souls, they can be even priests, people who are very generous for the people of God, lay people too who are doing great things for Jesus, but they are losing the balance. Things are getting out of order. And actually, one has to be careful if one is married, because one's first duty is, remember, always towards the family. And one can't please God by neglecting that overly. But this bit here is something classic and needs to be listened to. Is your task the care of souls? Then do not neglect your own. Now one sees that happening now more than ever actually, that many priests are very generous, and the result is that from very early in the morning until very late at night there's hardly a pause in their day. And being now readily accessible through all the modern means of communication, they spend the free moments they might have catching up on messages which have come in. In other words, even in their quiet moments, they're with other people, but virtually. And many priests will tell you that the mobile phone is a plague, indeed a beast, it's actually an enslavement. One has to be very careful that one knows how to handle it. And if one has it on, one has to be aware that in causa, in cause, one is responsible for the consequences, which are going to be a succession of long, demanding phone calls. Because courteously one cannot put it down. So you have it on, and you're there saying now and again, yes, yes, and the person is still there half an hour later. Now that can happen not just once, but one after the other. Now, it applies to any person who has access to these things. In practice, just for you to be aware of the danger, when I saw these things coming in bit by bit in my own monastery there in Italy, I thought, if I do get back to the purely contemplative life, I will jettison all this, all the moorings. One, a mobile phone which is on. Two, email. Because email, by its very psychology, is something that demands an immediate answer. And an immediate answer calls an immediate answer to the answer. And on it goes. In other words, immediate, immediate, immediate. And several of them, one after the other. So, in other words, it's the contemplative mind becoming active. Because Jesus is no longer in practice the center of its attention. Because we're not superhuman beings and it cannot be done. The other television, which we didn't actually have in the community, but I knew the damage it did, because that is really a very loud monster in the hearth, and one is inviting Satan in. Now, I could go on, but there are little tricks which actually have already a preparatory role of giving space, but it doesn't stop there. Now listen to this. Then do not neglect your own. Do not spend yourself so completely on other people that you have nothing left for yourself. Now, in practice, one big one was the choice from the beginning to give people a clear message that one was not available after Compline, that therefore in practice the door would not be opened or nothing would be replied to after 8 o'clock in the night. It's the monastery discipline, and I kept it, and it makes a big difference, because then if you have the early rise, no one will get to you until Mass in the morning at 7. They will start there coming in, and in fact this morning before 7 I had a confession, but nevertheless those virgin hours belong to Jesus, and they're quite different, exposing the Blessed Sacrament there in the hours of night when you have no contact with the world, the mind is free. And Jesus can get through to you and whisper something to you because you're giving him the chance. You're giving him that sacred space. Now start the day without that green area and jump into activity. You're not going to get it back. It's rare that one gets that precious time back. And remember that on the level of the whole church, that was the tendency. All the religious orders had it inbuilt into their timetable. Of the 24 hours, 12 were in the Great Silence. And therefore, there would be that otherness about night and also the early rise, which is better than the late night, because that early bit, empty, listening, not talking, is very, very, very powerful, mystical even. And all the orders of the church, and they're still like that in the East, have it and had it, and until recently, when precisely demands of pastoral life, this element of imbalance changed that balance between 24, that is divided into 12, with half given entirely to God and half then to men. Because the Lord gave the model. He would spend nights in prayer. It was a gentle hint. He would not need it as we would need it, but he chose to show our need for it by having it himself. I'm sure there were intimate moments within the beatific vision which he had there on the mountains of Galilee. And even when he did have a night's sleep, it says, doesn't it, more than once, rising up a great while before dawn, he rose up and went to pray, but in a separate place. That physicity of separation enters into it. And do you know that there was an indulgence for those who said the divine office in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament? That was a carrot, and it was a hint. And I remember seeing priests, because I was brought up by Benedictines there in my parish, they would be praying divine office and things before the Blessed Sacrament. It was an edifying thing, but it wasn't the same as sitting in an armchair and being disturbed by a phone call, but being there, with one's hood up in their case, in church, inaccessible, and they would whisper, because the old rule was you had to pronounce the words, because liturgy, even the breviary, is not just a private prayer. I open a parenthesis. In the mid-80s, a responsum was given from the Vatican through, I think, the head of the Congregation for the section which deals with the worship of the Church, the sacraments of worship, divine cult, that it was enough to read without pronouncing. That was actually a big response from the Vatican, but it was hardly noticed. But until then, the priests would always whisper the divine office. Now, he goes on. Of course, you have to look after the souls you have been put in charge of, but not to the extent that you forget your own. Brothers, do understand this. There is nothing quite so necessary to all churchmen as mental prayer. Now, this applies to every living soul. One can fool oneself with vocal prayer. One has a certain quantity that one gets through, but one can actually not have prayed if one isn't careful. Teresa of Avila makes the point quite clearly that the advantage of mental prayer, and she knew what she was talking about because they have 1 hour in the morning and 1 in the evening of pure silence in church. The advantage is that the whole attitude of soul is one of virtual yes, yes, yes. It's the fiat of the will saying, I want what you want. In other words, there's no fooling going on. One is looking at him eyeball to eyeball, he's getting his message through, and one is by the very position of the soul and body saying yes, yes, yes. He is in charge. Whereas with vocal prayer we can be, and we can be kidding ourselves. The vocal prayer, as the liturgy, as the breviary, as anything done as a quantity to be fulfilled, is, and I'm being told this years ago in France actually by the novice master who knew what he was talking about, a holy man. He said, ce n'est pas la prière, divine office in choir, isn't, he put it this way in strong language, isn't prayer, n'est pas la prière, mais est une occasion de prière, is an occasion of prayer. It can be prayer, he was saying. In other words, it's the space in which. So we had to get this message clearly from the beginning. Don't equate one with the other. The other bit has to happen, otherwise we're fooling ourselves. And it's the same with any soul in mode of prayer. What is going on? Because as with human beings, if, for instance, you're with, I don't know, your husband in front of the goggle box, there's not an awful lot of communion going on there. But if you're eyeball to eyeball, intimately discussing the things of the heart, then it's going on. There's the current passing. It's the same with him. If you're looking at him in the monstrance or in the tabernacle, loving him, gazing him, saying by your attitude, yes, 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 I'm listening, whatever you want, you are Lord, then it's happening. The advantage of vocal prayer, and that, by the way, is a big plus compared with e.g. our Protestants, that vocal prayer and structured prayer, sung prayer, liturgical prayer, rosary, whatever, gives you precisely more in the way of the opportunity of, l'occasion de. It's there as space in which you're giving time and opportunity. So do it well, and the rosary, well said, will actually act as it were, a creation of sacred otherness in which we're free to fly. But do that bit. Now, on he goes. Prayer that paves the way for every act we do. Now, he's coming into this there, that he is programming not himself, his day, but from this he is letting happen what the divine force and inspiration wants to happen. In other words, it's a mode of being in which God is operative. Now, it applies to anyone engaged in the words of the Lord, the work of the Lord, that one is there, available, available, available. Now, that accompanies it and follows it up. The psalmist says, I will sing and I will understand. And that's the old Vulgate translation he's got there. Brother, when you administer the sacraments, try to understand what it is you are doing. And that applies also to the rosary or anything that we do it actually engaging. Now, there is a danger in our Catholic spirituality not to be engaging. We have a lot of vocal prayer, and if we're not careful, we're actually wasting time, and it's not prayer at all. And the proof is, the quality of some of our rosaries, it's something else. We've got there! That was our prayer. We haven't prayed a bit, and it's there more than you think in Ireland. Here we are. When you celebrate Mass, we just had All Souls Day the other day. I remember I was living in a seminary in my first and third year doing classics there in Aberystwyth. The seminary's closed now, but we had one pep talk one evening. A priest, he was a good man, he's now dead, but he seems to have the Guinness Book of Records thing with regard to the speed. He was proudly saying in this class he gave us that he got through the 3 All Holy Soul Masses on the 2nd of November. The Mass for the Dead, you had the right to do 3 one after the other in those days. He got through them all together in 14, and he repeated 1/4 minutes. Now that's some going, that's supersonic speed. And to get to that, I'm not judging him now, but I'm saying what we're coming at, because I know from people who've been through the old regime, the quantity of vocal prayer in the old Mass was something else. The result was it was pretty nifty, I can tell you. So that's what the Vatican Council was trying to clean up. It was a huge mopping up operation. Calm down, reduce the number of prayers, but say them and mean them. And by the way, if you listen to a priest who has been, especially in renewal and so on, celebrating Mass now, with a priest who is only saying the old rite, you will find straight away that there's a difference in mentality. I just open a little parenthesis. I remember one time, because when I was in Italy, we were sometimes called upon to celebrate in the old rite in one church in the diocese. It was allowed, and there were shorter priests to do it. So off I'd go on a Sunday morning and sing in the old rite, Latin Mass there now and again. But I remember it was in a chateau with a chapel, a big castle with a chapel in it, and the count who had the chapel, he muttered one day, because we had grace afterwards, you see, grace at meals. You can see a person who says Mass in Italian, he prays properly. In other words, he knew, you see, that people also, when it comes to praying grace at meals, they won't go into this quick sign of the cross, but they'll actually go into mode. Now, he saw the difference. Now, that's the renewal, actually, that the Holy Spirit is trying to get through the church, and it's worked to some extent. To some extent, but not as much as you could have. Because in Ireland, you've got still a lot of priests who go at the same speed as they would have gone before, in fact. So it hasn't worked entirely. The whole optic of renewal is that every word should be felt. As in conversation, every word that you say sincerely is felt and thought. No less for God. And also, one thing we haven't got in Ireland is what was meant to happen in the renewal. Less wordiness, but more aerated prayer. Pauses. We're scared stiff of a minute's silence. And one way of getting rid of the silence is to speed up everything. And look at we're having Holy Communion. That's the most sacred moment of our day, week and existence, Holy Communion. And it has to be done as quickly as possible. 15 Eucharistic ministers, please. Yes, get it over and done. No, we've got to the end. Now, get to the important bit. The notices. There's applause. And Jesus was hardly thought about at the most important part of our existence. And he goes into this. When you celebrate Mass, consider what it is you are offering. In fact, at ordination, the old wording was imitate what you are handling. When you celebrate Mass, and singing in choir, remember to whom you are speaking and what you are saying to him. The gestuality enters into it, the mode of prayer. It's one thing to sit in one's armchair, it's another to have a thésée stool in a position of smallness, littleness, beggarliness, nothingness before the tabernacle. The great blessing is these thésée stools. If you are in charge of souls, remember, now this is the point, you love these souls with the tenderness of Christ the Redeemer, who would have died just for you, for one person, if you were the only one. He wants us to have that same attitude. If you're in charge of souls, he says, that cura animarum, that's the Latin, cure of souls, care of souls. A cura just has a care of souls. Now, remember in whose blood they have been washed. Let all that you do be done in love. It's a great blessing to have the precious blood in one's hands, in the sense that one can really communicate the merits of Calvary to a soul. Unexpected things happen, in that realm. The sacraments, they really are not just human actions. A few weeks ago I was called to the bedside of somebody who was already out of contact with us. She was in intensive care, wired up to the maximum in Drogheda. And I knew her, she was about in her early 30s. And so off I went myself with the oils, although I thought there's no point because she won't be able to say a thing. Anyway, we'll do what we can. So I had the oils with me and Holy Communion. That's the bit I thought there's hardly any point, but I took it anyway. And lo and behold, before I got there, she woke up. And she'd been sentenced to death, more or less. There's no hope, just leave her with God. That was what the doctors were saying. But she woke up. She was able to make a complete confession of her own without help, a good one. And to receive all the sacraments in one go, including the apostolic indulgence, full host, and I have big ones, these they come from the continent, and so on. And so anyway, I thought, well, she's bound to die anyway, so I did maximum, little kiss on the forehead, kind of safe home kind of thing. I'm leaving you with Jesus, just go safe journey on. So anyway, I went back, and I just heard again the other day, was it her brother who came to me? He came to me, one of the close members of the family, and he told me what had happened after I'd gone. She closed her eyes, and Jesus appeared before her eyes. He was there somehow, and something happened. It wasn't just, it was something, obviously something big happened. I don't know exactly what it was. She saw Jesus anyway, and they wanted to know, what did he look like? What did he look like? He looked as he does in the picture at home of the Divine Mercy. And she could see him up to there. And anyway, so basically, eventually, they pretty quickly took her off all these plugs and tubes, and very quickly she went home, and now she's taking her daughter to school, driving the car and so on, and she's got back to chemotherapy, which is completely abandoned. There's no point. She was just more or less pre-dead. So anyway, and that's a few months later now. I know, but things happen basically with regard to the sacraments. God is really present, They're not human actions at all. And things happen also in confession and so on. And it's important also in that realm that precisely in exercising anything which handles souls, that these souls receive not just the grace of the sacrament, but also the warmth of the humanity of the person who's actually exercising, because the Lord has given sacraments as links with him using our humanity, and therefore humanity enters into it, and there's a whole gestuality and tenderness which enters into it, which counts a lot as the extra. People feel it coming directly from Christ when it's done with the love of Christ. Therefore any sacrament, when handling people, should be done with that divine tenderness and never hurried, because people are genuinely and deeply and profoundly moved and healed in the sacramental field well celebrated. And he goes on, in whose blood they have been washed, let all that you do be done in love. In this way we shall easily overcome the 1001 difficulties that necessarily beset us every day, such as the world we live in. But he also has practical advice with regard to not losing the quality of our contact with God. You see how they're both linked. He has this, which I leave you with, to actually exercise, because it concerns you. Some of you are a lot involved with sacristies and things that happen in church. Now remember, once you're in church, you're in extraterritorial area. It doesn't belong to earth, it belongs to the angels, to heaven. It's the forecourt. The sacristy is the forecourt, really, the antechamber, but the church itself is something belonging. It is a portion of heaven on earth which has its own rules, not the human rules which are creeping in. God is served there in silence. That's his language, and we respond to him in that language. You fill it with noise and you're taking God's space. Silence is the correct attitude of the creature, as of the angels, in the presence of the divine. And if it's happening like that so quickly in Ireland, just be aware who's pushing. There are sinister forces pushing, because there's a great hatred for God in the underworld. Now, with regard to quality, such a man complains that as soon as he comes to choir to sing the divine office or starts to get ready for Mass, immediately 1,000 distractions invade his mind, enticing it away from God. But the question is, how had he been behaving in the sacristy before going into choir or beginning Mass? Now, there's a problem now in Ireland. We have to have someone, a third person, if we have children there. And these are usually a mother. And they come in, you see, and they're talking all the time in the sacristy before. It's a big nuisance. we were always brought up, the sacristy is a place of silence. I was brought up by the 6 Benedictines in Cardiff, and they wouldn't tolerate talking in the priest's sacristy. Once you were there, it was a place of silence. It was getting ready, we were in mode. And in fact, we were taught in Italy, we were formed there by it's the French community, as soon as you put on the chasuble, you were not to do anything else. You were already in persona Christi, and you had to hear that message. You were not accessible for anything. The chasuble, it means little house in Latin. You're there, you're already set apart before and after. And in fact, the whole preparation that we have in the monastic life is pretty powerful, because you do it, you start on everything in procession, you come out one after the other, and so on. And going back also, you glide out, you don't crash out. You go, and the grace then is absorbed. Of course, you handle things as best you can sometimes, because sometimes things I go wrong. Little parenthesis. Are you listening, you little people? Yeah, it was happening one day, because in Italy it's very hot, you see, so people, local people, it's in a wine area, they give you these huge things of wine, massive things, you see, and you have to put them from those things into bottles with a tube, so it's a long operation. We left a novice in there one day, and there he was, you see, 2.5 hours, you see, with these big, huge things of wine and about 30 degrees of heat, you see, outside. Anyway, he was working away quite happily, and then he came to office, you see, in the sacristy, and the prior was behind him. He had to give a clap off and go, you see, and he was in front of me. Anyway, we carried on the office regardless, and it's not quite so easy when you've got no organ to keep things without laughing, you know, the hernia coming on. But anyway, you do your best. Now, close the parenthesis. Anyway, to carry on, did he make any real effort to compose his thoughts? This is what I'm getting at, you see. Things like that are considerable nuisances, things going wrong. What means did he choose and put into practice to fix his attention? Well, I mentioned with regard to things, I remember being told that actually in France, in confession, the confessor, he said one time, it's not a good thing to read a letter just before the divine office. Now, transpose. If you open a text just before you go into mode of prayer, all the text is with you for the first 5 minutes. So there are certain tricks which work. You get bit by bit into mode, you try and limit the damage of things that can go wrong, forethought, because things do go wrong in church. But above all, you remember who you're serving and what you're doing. You've got the whole church behind you, you're doing a vicarious act, and you do it with the dignity of the angels who are asking you to do it in their name. And remember, the Vatican Council taught that the liturgy of the earth is somehow a reflection, an echo, a counterpart of what is happening in the angelic sphere. And at some points like now, when we come to the Holy, 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 we're actually joining our very words to theirs. So remember that. And after the words, sursum corda, lift up your hearts, goes right back to the early church, and it's in the east and the west, that formula, all liturgies have it. From that point onwards, there should be no earthly thought. The very gestuality is there. Lift up your hearts. We belong now from that point onwards to the court of heaven, and we're waiting with the angels for a genuine explosion of power. If we knew what was going on at the consecration, there's a whole myriad of angels on their knees waiting for it to happen. Just there waiting, just for the word, and it's come. We can't, but there's a huge explosion at the consecration. And some saints have seen what happens also with the power it has over the holy souls, which is what I finished, because it's offered for the holy souls, including your own, and they are hugely benefited. It's one last story. After ordination, I went to Medjugorje, I think about a few months later, just happened through friends in Ireland, I was in Italy at the time. So, and I had qualms of conscience about one issue. Is it the same to concelebrate as to celebrate on one's own? So anyway, somebody in the group had asked me, would you celebrate Mass for all our family tree, all those right back to Adam? Okay, but I'm not actually, I'm just one of the 50 who's going to be on the altar. Is that okay? Oh, that's fine, okay. So anyway, I took the intention. Now, he will be very balanced. He was nothing, no hype, very ordinary, normal farming man, wherever he was. So anyway, I applied the intention with all the other 50, with their intentions, and then he came to look for me afterwards, and he said something had happened. At the consecration, at the elevation of the chalice there, which obviously the main celebrant was handling, he saw something. He could see a whole cloud of souls going up and up into heaven. That is, what was happening, my question in prayer was being answered through him. Yes, there's infinity involved here, even in consolation. You're applying it equally, and it has a huge power there over all these souls. Now remember that right now. Put your souls, and that's why the first Eucharistic place is very powerful, because you've got these pauses. You can put the names in mentally. Do that. I'll give you plenty of time there to do it at the pause, especially for the dead. Put your deceased there in there, and remember, this is the closest we can get to touching them in the beyond. Here, there is no time. We're actually somewhat with one foot in heaven.